Old League vs Modern League is a debate that's happened 1,000 times before, and I'm sure the people clicking on this video are expecting me to just put on some nostalgia goggles about one of my old mains that was a rework and how much I miss it, trying my best to make up an argument as to why Riot should listen to me and revert them. But what I actually want to talk about today is how older champion design did in fact have real reasons as to why so many people liked them, and what we can learn from this to potentially make today's game a bit better. So subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoy, and let's hop right in. When it comes to what makes a good champion design, there are many factors from understanding demographics to the identity of the game, but what's important today refers more to the gameplay end of champion design, which primarily refers to two important traits, being depth and fairness. Depth refers to how replayable a champion is and is primarily done through two notable aspects, being kit interactivity and item interactivity. Kit interactivity refers to how interactive the kit is to use, for example if the kit has a fun combo or if the kit has good synergy. Modern champions are typically better when it comes to kit interactivity, and this aspect is a big reason as to why many older kits were seen as worse. For example, Annie and Twisted Fate, where despite them being strong and having good win rates, they still have low play rates due almost entirely to how their kits are very one-dimensional and have low gameplay variance, meaning your first game is very similar to the 100th, which for a game like League that is practically built on its replayability is an important attribute to be missing. And now compare this to a champion like Thresh, where his R is practically designed for his Q and E displacements, his W synergizes well with his Q mobility, and his E pairs well with his Q for a fun combo, all while still being useful as individual abilities. And while kit synergies and combos are a big part of kit interactivity, it also includes more basic things that you probably wouldn't think about, like how low the cooldowns are, where being able to use your kit more often is more fun, or how not having mana as a limiter means you can spam more often, which I believe was a big reason as to why those aspects were degraded so heavily over the years, despite so many downsides for doing so. Another one of these that a few older champions had and was lost over the years is minion interactivity, where some champions had abilities that could affect all allied units rather than just allied champions, which meant they could affect minions and pets. What this meant was that you could be a lot more creative in how you play, whether it's as simple as throwing old Nunu W on a minion to chunk the ranged top who went into the minion wave to poke you, to more complex ideas like a Nunu Annie bot lane combo, where you would throw his W on Tibbers for his super Tibbers. What these small little variables do is create more gameplay variance that makes the game more diverse and creative because it means there's more of a difference from one player to the next and how they interact with them. For example, my favorite playstyle of all time was old Nunu top, where I would max W and rush Banner, ZZ Rot, and Redemption to split push with, which was not only super fun for someone like me who prefers the more creative strategy side of League, but also for the enemy because it was a unique and interesting thing to see that made the game feel fresh and provided a new challenge. And this also goes hand in hand with the other half of depth, which is item interactivity. Item interactivity is pretty much the same as kit interactivity, where it provides more replayability to a champion, but rather than being things like kit synergies, combos, and such, item interactivity is related to items and stats, primarily done through scalings, and is where older champions typically shined at. For example, again, Thresh is a great example of what good item interactivity looks like. He's intended to be built tanky and play more as a frontliner, but he also has great AP scalings, a good AD scaling, and even his W shield that all open up new ways to play him and have fun with. And while these options aren't on par with his intended build and playstyle, they aren't meant to be and are simply meant to be a fun way to interact with the kit in a unique way, providing fun theory crafting possibilities with the items. A champion like Renata, on the other hand, is completely one-dimensional and has little to no item interactivity at all, where her passive and W practically have no scalings on them, her E has a very low AP scaling, and her R literally doesn't even have a scaling on it, meaning you can really only ever play Renata in one way, which makes her difficult to play more than a few games of. Say we threw an AD scaling onto her passive and maybe a small AD scaling on her Q, made her E scale a bit better with AP on the damage portion, and changed her ult to be magic damage on hit rather than target's own damage, which also then scaled with AP for an AP build, and then suddenly she has two new builds without really affecting her original playstyle. And like I said before, this idea of item interactivity could then be paired with the kit interactivity in an interesting way through small variables that provide very little to the kit, but can then be used in an interesting way to make the champion play differently. To explain what I mean, let's look at the old Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger's old passive healed his nearby turrets, and that was pretty much it. It was quite uninteractive and simply meant to make him not as hard countered by some pokes since the turrets were most of his power. But what if we took this idea and vamped it up a little with kit interactivity? For example, having it apply to all nearby allies rather than just his turrets. This means that for most of the time, the healing is small enough to be barely noticeable and seems like it shouldn't even exist because of how weak it is. But then this is where the item interactivity comes in. For example, making that heal scale based on his own health regeneration or healing and shielding, which means that in a majority of cases, it remains unused, but if the Heimerdinger wants to, he can spec into it for a fun, weird off-meta build. For example, building 3 rejuve beads as your start to emphasize the healing, and putting a turret in the river so that you can run down quickly to activate it for your jungle and mid to apply the healing effect, and then running back top. Or maybe you could do something similar to my old Nunu top strategy of using the turrets to heal up the wave for a weird split pushing build. By doing something so simple, we opened up so much more possibility for how you can play him and makes the game more diverse and creative for everyone. And I'm sure you're probably thinking, but what about the balance? This sounds horrible for the game. And the thing is that Riot not only have a very extensive data collection system in place that tells them every detail about everything, but they also have a balance tied directly to the items, meaning that if Heimerdinger wanted to build healing and shielding, it would come with purposeful downsides like less damage and less survivability, essentially morphing his class into that of an enchanter when he specs into their items. And then in terms of fairness, since I've already beaten this topic half to death, I won't waste too much time on it, but it essentially just refers to counterplay and high gameplay moments. For example, Yumi and how she can be untargetable and invulnerable to incoming damage, with the only way of dealing with her being to just kill the ally she's on, which I would honestly struggle to even call counterplay. The primary reason it exists is due to Riot's idea of high gameplay moments, which are essentially just them making the champion intentionally overpowered and unbalanced for the sake of making them more fun to play, which they fully understand comes at the cost of the enemy's fun, but just don't care because they value the gambling-esque high feeling that people get for pulling off crazy 5-man Yone ults or Sion getting 10k health and then one-shotting you, as if people needed to be tricked into playing League. The next 2 points on the other hand are a bit more interesting, which is game state and intensity. Back in the day, time to kill was significantly slower, not only in the laning phase, but also later on. What this meant was that there was a healthy balance between consistent damage, most notably basic attacks, and burst damage. But with the absolute massive power creep of CDR and shorter base cooldowns, as well as some other changes like the aforementioned damage power creep, it meant that the consistency burst balance was lost and burst power crept into the consistency area that basic attacks were supposed to be best at, while at the same time the durations of fights was lowered to the point where consistency was objectively less optimal. And whether it was intentional or just a case of this feels good so we should do it, without realizing that the power creep was occurring, we started seeing more and more updates to older champions where burst became the main focus. Champions like Aurelia and how she went from being primarily based around her W basic attacks to a bursty ability caster, Fiddlesticks' W going from a 5-second channel to a quick bursty ability, or Cho'Gath's E and how it literally just became an active ability that only works on his next 3 basic attacks. And of course, this topic has a lot of factors feeding into it and is quite complicated, but the end result is still the same, where most slower paced kits that had an emphasis on longer durations were either straight up just deleted in favor of having bursty high tempo effects, or in the case of something like Jax and Volibear, the consistency still exists, but you kinda just one-shot things anyway, so it doesn't really have that same appeal. And in addition to this, whether because they misunderstood stat checks being point and clicks and stat steroids, or if it was them wanting to make the combat flashier for the viewability of the esports scene, we started seeing champions become much higher intensity. For example, Fiora is a great example of what I mean. Fiora was always a fairly high tempo champion because she was kind of a lane bully who wanted to trade frequently, but her kit was still quite low intensity because her abilities didn't really take that much thought process to use most of the time, with 2 point and clicks, 2 passives, and a non-targeted W. And for people like myself who prefer those slower paced, low intensity kits, and preferred League more as a strategy game rather than a fighting game, a majority of champions I enjoyed tended to fall into that area where yeah, I do like a good game of Zeri or Yasuo now and then, but a large majority of my time was spent on those champions like Fiddle, Akali, and KO. And this is also why I think there has been more and more of an outcry for a return to those simple champions, because of course there are numerous benefits to having champions like Zeri, but it's more of a gameplay preference, and some people simply just prefer more simple, low-intensity champions. And you don't even need to love champions like Old Warwick or even want to main him, but everyone needs a good game of Jungle Warwick with some lo-fi on, for when life gets a little more exhausting or stressful. And then lastly, before I end this off, is Pointless Overload. Pointless overload is the term that refers to the small variables on a kit, similarly to the suggestion I mentioned earlier, but as the name implies, adds no interactivity to the kit and is pretty much just there to add more power. For example, Akshan. Why does his passive deal increased damage to minions? Why does he gain movement speed for cancelling his second auto attack? Why does his second shot deal 100% on-hit effectiveness? Why does this passive give him shield for 2 seconds when he procs it? Why does this Q grant him movement speed if he hits a champion? And I could unironically keep going for a solid 13 more examples on just action alone. You could remove all of this pointless overload, and not only would he be infinitely more fun to play against, but in some cases he would even be more fun to play as, because oftentimes with pointless overload, like his percent missing health scaling, that power is being forced onto the kit rather than allowing him to build for it in an interesting way, like the Renative passive I talked about earlier. There was an interview done with Certainly T a while back where they talk about this exact thing when talking about the champion design process, where he mentions how they typically start with a hook or idea and then start working from there and getting more complicated over time, and in his case that he most likely just doesn't do enough trimming at the end. And to be honest, this does make sense. In the action example, I'm sure while they were working on it, they had the idea of making the 3-hit passive have a little more pop feeling to it, so they threw on a shield and realized how good it felt in playtesting. Then I'm sure while they were working on it, they realized the 2-hit gimmick felt kinda clunky and people were cancelling it a lot in the playtesting, so they threw on a movement speed boost and suddenly it felt a lot better, and so on with most of the overloadedness of today. And while I can understand where this is coming from, I also think it's a pretty shallow excuse and that a designer, especially one from Riot, should know better. And in the same interview, he says that game design isn't a science and that they often stumble around looking for answers, but I would also disagree with this notion, and that with solid foundations like a class system and an understanding of what makes a good design, the only part that isn't a science is being experienced enough with the game to understand what's fun and what people would like. But either way, let me know what you guys think about this one, especially if you're an older player from the early seasons. I would love to hear what you guys think about the differences between old and modern champions, and if you have any other ideas. Subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.